Good evening. We are now starting our fourth video, and we're getting into some of the very, very practical aspects of shechita. First of all, the definition of a kosher shechita in a bird or an animal is if we cut 100% of two pipes. If you put your finger here, you can feel the hard cartilage that's right here where you have the bump on the front of your neck, and that is your windpipe. That's where your air goes when you breathe. And behind that is going straight in. If I were to take that out and move it to the side, is a second tube, and that's the tube that the food goes in. The tube that the air goes through in Hebrew is called a kaneh, and the tube that the food goes through is called a veshet. Okay? In English, it's the trachea is the air tube, and the esophagus is where the food goes. The definition of a kosher shechita is ideally to slaughter, to cut either, both of those rather. Both of those should be cut 100%. However, if you cut more than 50% of both of them, it's still kosher. When I say both of them, that's referring to an animal. But when we talk about birds, you only have to slaughter a little more than 50% of one of them. So in the worst case scenario with birds, if you cut 51%, let's say, of just, it's late at night here in Israel now, and I'm tired. If you slaughtered only 51% or the majority of one of those two tubes in a bird, it's kosher. Okay, we're now going to talk a little bit about the knife. Shechita knife is very sharp, as you can imagine. We saw how sharp it is. It's perfectly smooth. Look how shiny it is. You can actually see the book that's in front of me. This is the Shulchan Aruch that I'm trying to use as a guide. I'm sorry for the yawning. If I bring it in close, maybe you can see the edge is, you see where it's shiny up there. It's perfectly smooth. And before I slaughter the bird, I have to be sure that there's absolutely no nicks in the knife. And the way I do that is by taking a fingernail and slowly running it up the knife. I'm not putting pressure on it. Every so often, I move the finger a little bit so that it doesn't cause there to be a groove in the knife, in the fingernail rather, I'm sorry. And I go in one direction, and then I go in another direction. And sure enough, going up, I didn't feel anything. But when I come down right here, right over there, I feel that there's a little bit of a nick in the knife. So this knife needs to be worked on. In addition to going along the very top of the knife, here, look here, like this. Okay, can you see how I'm doing the very, very top of the knife? In addition to going up and down on the top of the knife, we go a little bit on the side of the knife, okay? So I'm checking that the side of the blade also is has no nicks on it. I feel the nick there now. And the same thing on this side. So we go up and down, and it's one of the very few places where the Jewish law says we have to use a tremendous amount of concentration, and we have to do it slowly, because if there's the slightest nick in the knife, the shechita is invalid. Okay, so that's how we test it. We test it with our finger. The amount of a nick is the slightest bit. Even the teeniest bit is considered to be invalid. Now, when do we check the knife? The knife has to be checked before the shechita. Why? Because we want to be sure that we are cutting with a knife that's 100% okay. But we also have to check it after the shechita. And the reason we have to check it after the shechita is because the Talmud says that we're concerned that possibly it became invalid on the skin, on the outside, or the feathers, in which case the knife is valid, is kosher. I come to slaughter the bird, and as I start cutting the skin, even before I've gone through, I make a little nick in the knife. And therefore, when I check this knife after the shechita, and there's a nick in it, I'm not sure, maybe the nick happened at the end of the shechita, but it's also very possible that it happened at the beginning of the shechita, and therefore if we find a nick in the knife after the shechita, we consider the shechita itself to be invalid. So therefore, the knife has to be checked 2 times. It has to be checked before the shechita. If you're shechting many animals, you could shecht many animals if you want, many birds. The problem is that, let's say I shechted 10 birds, okay? So I shechted the first bird, and I knew before I started that the knife was okay and it had no nicks in it. And then I shechted the 10th bird, and at the end of the 10th bird, I check it, and there's a nick in it. So now, what do? Do I say that only the 10th bird is not kosher? Maybe it was messed up before the 10th bird? Or do I say maybe it happened on the skin of the first bird before I even shechted any of them? So the answer is that, yeah, we're stringent, and we say if a nick should occur after multiple birds, we forbid all of the birds from the moment you started doing that shechita, which is wise. You'll see from experience when we do it, you'll see that generally that doesn't happen. One concern is that if you cut too far or too deep, you can end up cutting through and actually cutting the neck, the bone, behind these 2 pipes, right? The neck is back here and the 2 pipes are in the front. As you cut through, you can put pressure on the bone, and then there's a real concern that possibly you will cause there to be a nick. A nick in Hebrew is called a pegima. So there are 3 words we have to remember. Kaneh, which is the air pipe, which in English is called trachea. Veshet is the other Hebrew word you need to know, which is the food pipe. And pegima is a nick in the knife, okay? And when I'm testing the knife, I'm checking to see if there's a pegima, okay? I go up and I go down, okay? So, let me see. Now, sometimes you can have a situation where there are no pegimas in the knife, but the knife is not smooth. You'll see what I mean. Like, the knife that we're going to be using is so smooth you can barely, it just flows across the edge of it, even though it's very, very sharp. But sometimes it can be, how do I describe it to you? A little bit without pegimot, but not smooth. Not smooth like a piece of glass that your hand just flows over. Meaning there's no nicks in it, but it's not like super smooth like glass. And our tradition is to try and make it as smooth as we can. So the example that the Talmud gives is that if any of you have ever felt the tip of some wheat, where there's like the strings that come out of the wheat, the wheat berries here, and then there are the pointed like hairs that stick out. If you run your finger along those hairs, there's a bit of a roughness to those hairs. And if it's like that, as long as there's no pegima, it's okay, but ideally we would like it to be smooth. Let me think. No, that's good. Now, here's an interesting question. Let's say I have the knife, and it's completely kosher. There are no pegimot in the knife, but the knife isn't sharp. So the Talmud again says, when I do my cutting, I can go back and forth all day long, okay? As long as I don't chop it off, but I'm rather doing a cutting motion, it's okay, and it's considered to be kosher, even though the knife is not so sharp. Obviously, we want to be sure that the knife is sharp, right? Because that means that there's much less suffering to the animal. If you know that there's a pegima in your knife, it's forbidden to use that knife. So you have to be sure. And if there's a pegima, it means you're not allowed to shecht, right? Okay, now, let's say you have a knife that you keep in a special box, or for example, our knives are going to be kept in a special case. And you know that before you started doing your shechita, that knife was 100% kosher, okay? It's now been put away, we tested it, and we know that it's good. If you didn't check it before, even though you're supposed to, you always have to check it. But if you didn't and you took it out, you can assume that it's okay. When we're done, like I said to you, we have to check it again. But what would happen if you have a reason to suspect that something else caused the nick to be there after you shechted? For example, let's say you shechted, you knew the knife was 100% kosher beforehand, and before you could test it after the shechita, the knife fell out of your hand and landed on some rocks, and you saw that it landed on the ground hard, and now you're feeling a pegima. So the Talmud says it's reasonable to suspect that was the cause of the pegima, and therefore those birds would be kosher. Let me just think. Yeah. The custom is, in the old days, that there would be a rabbi that was appointed to just check the knives. And the tradition today is that if you're slaughtering, let's say, and a rabbi shows up, particularly a very learned rabbi, the custom is to hand that rabbi your knife and have him check it. It's sort of a sign of honor by giving it to the rabbi to check. These days, most rabbis don't know how to check a knife because it's become such a specialized sort of thing. Very interesting law in the Shulchan Aruch is that if you're slaughtering animals, you have to receive payment whether or not the animals are kosher. Because if you only get payment from the animals that are kosher, and if you happen to slaughter an animal incorrectly, you wouldn't get paid for that animal. That means that you have an incentive to sort of look the other way, or you have an incentive to think that it's one way when maybe it's really the other way. So the rabbis were concerned about that. And finally, before we continue, before the beginning of slaughtering, there's a blessing that we make, and the blessing is Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu Melech Olam Asher Kiddushanu B'Mitzvotav V'Tzivanu Ala Shechita. Blessed art thou, our Lord our God, who has commanded us with his commandments, and has commanded us to with his commandments, and we make a blessing on blessed art thou, Lord our God, regarding the shechita. So again, that blessing is Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu Melech Olam Asher Kiddushanu B'Mitzvotav V'Tzivanu Al HaShechita. And we must make that blessing beforehand. If you're doing multiple birds, one blessing is sufficient, okay? You're ideally not supposed to speak after you did that, just like when you wash your hands for bread. You don't want to have anything that interrupts sort of your train of thought, what you're involved in. Of course, if there are questions that relate to the shechita, so then you're allowed to ask those questions, or if you have to speak regarding something regarding the shechita, so all of that is permissible. Let me think. Anything else? No, I think that is sufficient now. And I wish you a good evening, and we're moving on. We'll have probably another 2 or 3 short videos, and I think that will be finished. Have a good night, everybody.